"Not this table, Caroline," Preston whispered. But the billionaire had already stopped in front of the poorest man in the diner. Outside, a Vermont snowstorm pressed its white palms against the windows, rattling the glass with sudden bursts of wind. Inside Miller's Corner Diner, forks froze halfway to mouths. Coffee cups hovered in midair, and the old television above the pie display still showed Caroline Whitaker's face beneath the headline, "Billionaire Philanthropist Arrives for Tonight's Charity Gala." She stood there in a camel-colored coat darkened by melting snow, her hair tousled by the weather and her eyes carrying a kind of exhaustion that even money could not hide. In the last booth beneath a flickering yellow lamp, Ethan Miller sat with his 9-year-old daughter, Sophie, sharing a single plate of pancakes cut carefully into equal pieces. The cuffs of his jacket were worn thin. Sophie's mittens did not match. Between them sat 2 glasses of water and 1 tiny bowl of syrup, stretched as carefully as everything else in their lives. Caroline looked at the empty seat across from them, then at Ethan. "May I sit with you?" The entire diner seemed to stop breathing. Preston stepped closer and lowered his voice, as though kindness was some kind of public relations mistake. "Caroline, there's a private room in the back. The press is outside. This isn't the image we discussed." Ethan slowly raised his eyes. He did not recognize power when he looked at her. He did not see the fortune, the cameras, the foundation, or the polished name the rest of the country repeated with admiration. He saw only a woman standing in wet shoes, trying very hard not to look lonely. "It's just a chair," he said. Sophie immediately slid out of the booth and pulled the seat back with both hands. "You can sit here. My mom used to say lonely people should never have to eat alone." Caroline blinked. For one fragile moment, the famous woman who had spoken before senators, investors, and stadiums looked as though a child had touched an old bruise hidden somewhere inside her heart. She sat down carefully, as though the cracked vinyl booth deserved more respect than the velvet chairs waiting for her at the gala. Behind the counter, Mrs. Evelyn Brooks stopped wiping the same coffee stain she had been polishing for the last 10 minutes. A truck driver near the door leaned back in his seat. 2 teenagers stopped whispering. Even the grill seemed to quiet down, its softness fading beneath the weight of something no one in the room could name. Ethan pushed the syrup a little closer to Caroline. "We only ordered 1 plate," he said without embarrassment. "But there's enough for everyone if nobody minds smaller pieces." Preston gave a short, disbelieving laugh. "Sir, do you have any idea who you're talking to?" Ethan sighed, then gave Sophie the better half of the remaining pancake. "A hungry person," he said. "Usually, that's enough information." Caroline looked at the pancake, then at the man sitting across from her. His hands were rough from work, with traces of flour near his knuckles. Yet there was a steadiness in them that reminded her of letters she had secretly kept for years. Letters from a stranger who had signed them with only 2 initials. E.M. She had come to this small town searching for the person who had saved her when she was a forgotten 12-year-old girl whose eyesight was failing, with no family able to pay for the treatment she needed. She had searched old records, church basements, scholarship files, and fire-damaged archives. One final clue had led her to this diner, though even she could not fully explain why. And now, sitting across from her, Ethan Miller smiled gently at his daughter and broke his own piece of pancake in half again. Caroline did not know it yet, but the man everyone in the room had quietly judged was the reason she had been able to see the world clearly at all. Caroline reached for the fork Ethan offered her. Before she could take a bite, the bell above the diner door rang again, and a gust of cold air swept inside like an unwanted opinion. Ethan stood without hesitation, crossed the room, and pushed the door shut with his shoulder. Outside, a small elderly man was struggling to pull his coat tighter against the snow. His boots were sinking into the slush beside the curb. Ethan looked at him. Then he glanced toward the nearly empty tip jar by the register. He did not sigh. He made no announcement. He simply reached into his pocket, pulled out his last $5 bill, folded it once, and placed it in Mrs. Brooks's hand. "A bowl of soup for Mr. Harlan," he said quietly. "Put it on my tab." Mrs. Brooks looked at him with the tired sadness of someone who had watched him give away money he needed himself. "Ethan, you already worked a double shift." "Then I earned enough to share." Sophie watched from the booth, her chin resting on both hands. She looked proud. And worried. Caroline noticed. It was the look of a child who knew her father was a good man but also understood that goodness did not always pay the electric bill. Ethan returned to the booth, brushed snow from his sleeve, and sat down as though nothing had happened. Preston studied him with narrowed eyes. Do you make a habit of feeding strangers? Ethan poured a little more syrup onto Sophie's side of the plate. Only when they're hungry. That's not a financial plan, Preston said. Ethan smiled faintly. No. It's just human. The words settled heavily over the booth. The yellow light above them flickered again, illuminating the fine lines around Ethan's eyes, the small burn mark on his wrist from the grill, and the wedding ring he still wore on a chain beneath his shirt. Some promises did not disappear simply because the people who made them were gone. Ethan had lived in Maple Falls long enough for people to believe they knew him. They knew he drove an old blue pickup truck with one rusted fender. They knew he rented a tiny apartment above the laundromat on Maple Street. They knew he packed Sophie's lunch in brown paper bags and walked her to school whenever the truck refused to start. What they did not know was that every month, even during the hardest months, Ethan mailed a small envelope to a scholarship fund that had changed its name 3 times in 10 years. Sometimes it contained $40. Sometimes $12. Once, after Sophie had been sick with the flu and an unexpected plumbing bill arrived, the envelope contained only 4 $1 bills and a note. For someone who needs tomorrow. He never signed his full name. Only E.M. Sophie had once asked him why they helped children they would probably never meet. It had been late October. The first frost had silvered the laundromat windows, and Ethan was counting coins at the kitchen table. Because your mother believed that one child helped at the right moment might grow up and become a miracle for someone else, he told her. Sophie thought seriously about this. Then she pushed several coins from her own piggy bank toward him. Then send these too, she whispered. Maybe someone needs a little miracle. Now, sitting across from Caroline Whitaker, that same child tore a tiny piece from a napkin, folded it into a small paper heart, and placed it beside Caroline's coffee cup. Caroline stared at it as though it was something priceless. Something rare. Something no boardroom had ever given her. You have a very kind daughter, she said. Ethan looked at Sophie, and the exhaustion on his face softened into something close to grace. She had a good teacher. Her mother? Caroline asked gently. Ethan nodded once. And life. Life teaches you too, if you let it make you softer instead of harder. Preston shifted impatiently and checked his phone, already calculating the damage this strange little dinner might cause to Caroline's public image. But Caroline was no longer listening to him. She watched Ethan lift his glass of water and quietly give Sophie the final piece of pancake. It was as though dignity was not something a man announced. It was something he practiced when no one important was supposed to be watching. Caroline held Sophie's paper heart between her fingers. For a moment, the diner disappeared beyond its fragile edges. The voices near the counter blurred. The storm pressed harder against the windows. Somewhere behind her, the television continued showing advertisements about her foundation, her speeches, and her smiling face beside governors and school children. But the woman sitting in that booth did not feel like that woman tonight. She felt 12 years old again. A frightened girl sitting beside a cracked window in the basement of a church in upstate New York, pretending she could still read the words on the blackboard as the letters began to blur and disappear. Back then, her name opened no doors. Caroline Whitaker owned 2 sweaters, 1 pair of shoes reinforced with cardboard inside the soles, and a fear so large she carried it like a second backpack. Are you all right? Ethan asked softly. Caroline looked up too quickly. Yes, she said. I was just thinking. Preston gave a polished smile. Caroline thinks a lot. That's why half the country wants 5 minutes of her time. Ethan ignored the bait. That must be lonely. Preston scoffed. Lonely? She owns buildings in 6 states. Sophie tilted her head. Do buildings talk to you when you're sad? Caroline looked at the child. The truth inside that simple question struck harder than any compliment she had heard all year. She placed the paper heart beside her cup and wrapped both hands around the warm ceramic. Not because she was cold. Because she needed something steady. The real reason Caroline had come to Maple Falls had nothing to do with the charity gala, the cameras, or the ceremonial ribbon cutting at the new education center. Those were convenient reasons. Respectable reasons. Reasons Preston could schedule and explain. The true reason was hidden inside a leather folder in her hotel room beneath contracts and lists of sponsors. 8 letters. 9 old receipts. And 1 black and white photograph clipped from a local newspaper nearly 22 years earlier. It showed a thin girl in thick glasses standing outside St. Agnes Children's Home, smiling shyly beside a nurse after receiving the eye surgery no one had expected her to get. At the bottom of the earliest receipts, written in blue ink, were 2 initials. EM. No full name. No address that still existed. Just monthly payments. Sometimes small. Sometimes strangely exact, as though the donor had given whatever remained after groceries, rent, and all the other demands of life had taken their share. The letters had arrived with the money. They were never long. Never sentimental. Just enough words to keep a frightened girl from giving up. You are not alone. Keep reading. The world will need what you see. Caroline had gone on to build an empire in educational technology. But before the investors, before the awards, before she became the kind of woman people stood up for when she entered a room, she had those letters. They followed her through foster homes, community college, night jobs, and the first company she built in a rented room with poor heating and borrowed chairs. She had quietly hired investigators. She had searched church records. She traced the old scholarship fund through a fire, a merger, a storage warehouse, and finally to a handwritten accounting ledger that mentioned Maple Falls. Now she was sitting in the last booth of a small diner, watching a tired single father wipe a drop of syrup from his daughter's hand with the corner of a napkin. His name was Ethan Miller. EM. The initials struck her thoughts like a match against paper. But she pushed the idea away. It seemed too impossible. Too humble. Too close. She had always imagined the person behind the letters as someone older and wealthier. Perhaps a retired doctor. A quiet lawyer with extra money. Not a man with worn cuffs, gentle eyes, and a dinner he kept making smaller so everyone else could have enough. What brought you to town? Ethan asked. For the first time in years, Caroline opened her mouth and found that the rehearsed answer would not come. She looked at Sophie's paper heart, then at the snowstorm beyond the window. I'm looking for someone. Someone who disappeared. Her voice softened. No. Someone who found me first. The words remained between them like a candle flame no one wanted to disturb. Ethan looked at her with quiet stillness. He had learned long ago that people carried locked rooms inside themselves. Love was not breaking down the door. Love was waiting on the porch with warm food until they were ready to open it. Then I hope you find him, Ethan said. Caroline studied his face, searching for recognition, for some flash of guilt or pride. She found only quiet kindness. Preston put his phone back into his coat pocket and leaned forward. Caroline, we are already late. The gala has been waiting 20 minutes. We cannot build a national education company around you eating pancakes in a diner with strangers. Sophie frowned. We are not strangers anymore. Preston gave her the kind of smile adults use when they want a child to feel small. That's sweet, but Miss Whittaker has responsibilities. Ethan's expression remained calm, but his voice became firmer. At this table, her name is Caroline. For the first time that evening, Preston had no immediate answer. The old clock above the counter ticked loudly. Snow slid down the windows in wet sheets. Mrs. Brooks poured coffee for a man who had already paid, then quietly filled a second cup for someone who had not. Caroline felt the fragile architecture of her public life shift. Not collapse. Simply loosen. Titles had always protected her. Schedules had fenced her in. Money had built rooms where no one could come too close. But here, in a booth with cracked red vinyl and a napkin holder leaning slightly to one side, a little girl had called her by her first name. And a tired father had defended that name without wanting anything in return. Do you like to draw? Caroline asked Sophie, nodding toward the sketchbook beside her plate. Sophie brightened. Every day. Dad says drawing is how quiet people talk. Ethan smiled. She talks plenty without it. Dad, that didn't sound like a complaint. Sophie opened her sketchbook with careful pride. She flipped past drawings of snowmen, school buses, a brown dog with wings, and a picture of her mother drawn as a star above their small apartment building. Then she stopped on a page Caroline was not prepared to see. It showed a large hall filled with elegantly dressed people. Every chair was occupied except one. At the edge of the room stood a woman in a long coat, turned slightly away, her hands folded in front of her as though she had forgotten how to ask for anything. Across the top, in uneven pencil, Sophie had written, "The lady without a table." Caroline's fingers tightened around her coffee cup. "Why did you draw her?" she asked quietly. Sophie shrugged, suddenly shy. "I saw you on television last week." Everyone was clapping, but you looked like nobody was sitting with you. Preston shifted uncomfortably. That is a rather creative interpretation. Ethan did not look at him. He looked at Caroline. Children notice the things adults edit out. The sentence reached her so gently that it hurt. Caroline had spent years being admired in crowded rooms. Yet no one had noticed the empty chair beside her. Not investors. Not politicians. Not journalists praising her vision. A child sitting in a diner booth had noticed it through a television screen. For a moment, Caroline could not speak. She turned back a page and found another drawing. A man held an umbrella over two children while rain soaked his own shoulders. Underneath it, Sophie had written, "Dad helping again." "Does he do that often?" Caroline asked. Sophie nodded proudly. "He says even when your hands are full, you can still make room in your heart." Ethan cleared his throat. "Sophie, people don't need all my philosophy with dessert." "But it's true." "Truth needs manners too." Caroline laughed. Not the polished laugh she gave sponsors. Something surprised and human. It broke through the tension like sunlight through a dirty window. Even Ethan smiled. Mrs. Brooks turned away, her eyes wet. Preston, however, looked toward the front window, where two local photographers had gathered beneath the awning and were aiming their cameras toward the booth. His expression hardened. Caroline saw the calculation immediately. The fear of an unscripted photograph. The belief that sitting beside a poor man could somehow stain a billionaire's brand. But Caroline was no longer afraid of being seen there. She looked again at Sophie's drawing of the lonely woman without a table. "May I keep this?" she asked. Sophie looked at Ethan for permission. He nodded. "Only if you promise that next time you'll sit at a table," Sophie said. Caroline looked at Ethan. Then around the diner, where the silence had softened into something almost warm. "I think," she said, "I just did." Preston saw the photographers raise their cameras, and something inside him reacted. At first, it was not loud, not obvious. It was smooth and practiced. The movement of a man who believed every human moment needed to be controlled before it became a headline. He stood beside the booth and lightly placed one hand on the back of Caroline's seat. "That's enough," he said, still smiling toward the windows. A touching little pause, "but we are finished here." Caroline looked up at him. "I decide when I'm finished." "No," Preston said in a lower voice. "The foundation decides. The board decides. The sponsors waiting at the hotel decide. You are the face of a national company, not a woman collecting sad stories in a snowstorm." The diner changed after that. A spoon struck a plate. Someone near the counter muttered under his breath. Ethan slowly folded his napkin and placed it beside the empty pancake plate. "You can speak to me however you like," he said calmly. "But you don't need to speak for her." Preston turned fully toward him. Every trace of politeness disappeared. "And who exactly are you?" Sophie tensed. Ethan did not. "I'm her father," he said, nodding toward Sophie. "That's the only title I need tonight." Preston laughed once, sharply. Of course. The noble single father. The worn jacket. The adorable child with drawings. "Forgive me if I've seen this script before." Caroline's eyes narrowed. Preston. But he had already started performing for the cameras outside and for the invisible audience he imagined would appreciate his caution. People like this know how to position themselves. They sit close to sympathy. They offer pancakes. They say humble things. Then next week comes a fundraiser, a medical bill, crowdfunding, or some quiet request for help. The words fell like dirty snow. Cold. Small. Cruel enough to wound, yet polished enough to pretend they were practical. Sophie's face flushed. "My dad doesn't ask people for money." Preston looked down at her. "Sweetheart, grown-up matters are complicated." Ethan gently placed his hand over Sophie's small fist before anger could teach her the wrong lesson. "Let it go," he whispered. "But he's lying." "I know." "Then say something." Ethan looked at Preston. Then at Caroline. Then at the people pretending not to listen. The grill hissed behind the counter. The wind rattled the old diner sign outside. The yellow lamp above the booth hummed as if trying to hold the entire room together. "Everyone has a sad story," Ethan finally said. "Not everyone uses it to buy kindness. And not everyone who looks poor is trying to sell their pain. Several people lowered their eyes. Mrs. Brooks froze with the coffee pot still in her hand. Caroline's breathing changed. She had heard wealthy men insult competitors. She had watched journalists twist motives and board members reduce children to numbers in quarterly reports. But this was different. Preston was not attacking a strategy. He was attacking dignity. And somehow Ethan refused to surrender his. Preston leaned closer. Then prove me wrong. Tell us why you're really sitting here with her. Ethan answered without hesitation. Because she asked. That was all. No defense. No plea. No wound displayed for applause. Just the truth. Simple enough to embarrass everything complicated around it. Caroline felt something rise in her chest. Something older than anger and softer than pride. She looked at Ethan's worn cuffs. At Sophie's trembling lips. At the half-empty bowl of syrup between them. And she realized the poorest thing at that table was not money. It was Preston's imagination. He could not imagine kindness without a hidden invoice. He could not imagine a chair offered without a trap beneath it. Then the diner door opened again. 2 photographers stepped inside, brushing snow from their coats. One lifted his camera. Miss Whitaker, is this part of tonight's charity event? Preston immediately straightened and restored his smile. Just a brief moment of community engagement, he said. Nothing official. But Sophie slipped out of the booth before Ethan could stop her. She stood beside her father, tiny in her mismatched mittens, her eyes shining with tears she refused to let fall. It's official to me, she said. He feeds people when no one is taking pictures. The first camera flash exploded through the room. White. Sudden. Ethan closed his eyes for half a second. Not from fear. From the exhaustion of being noticed only when someone needed a story. Then Caroline stood. Slowly. Carefully. Holding Sophie's drawing against her coat. She did not look at the cameras. She looked at Ethan. And in the silence that followed, she began to wonder whether the man she had searched for across the country had been sitting in front of her all along. There was no second flash. Ethan raised one hand toward the photographers. Not angrily. Simply refusing. Please, he said. Not my daughter. Something in his voice made even the photographers lower their cameras. Caroline turned toward them with the same calm authority that could silence a board of directors. No more photographs. Preston's smile tightened. Caroline, that isn't wise. It wasn't a request. The photographers stepped back. For several seconds, only the storm spoke, pushing snow against the windows and sending cold air through the old frames. Sophie wiped her cheek with the back of her mitten and looked at her father with fierce, childish sadness. They always think you want something, she whispered. Ethan crouched beside her. People think the way they know how to think. They don't know you. It's all right. No. It isn't. Before he could stop her, Sophie ran toward the narrow hallway near the restrooms, where a back staircase led toward the small apartment above the neighboring laundromat. Sophie. Ethan called. But she was already gone. Her boots struck each stair like a tiny heartbeat refusing to be ignored. Mrs. Brooks put down the coffee pot. She's going for the box, she murmured. Ethan looked at her. The color drained from his face. Evelyn, no. Caroline heard the change in his voice. Not quite fear. Something deeper. The pain of a man whose hidden kindness was about to be dragged into the light. Preston noticed it too. For the first time, his confidence faltered. What box? No one answered. The diner waited. A minute passed. Then another. The old clock ticked above the counter. Somewhere along Main Street, a snowplow rumbled by. Caroline stood beside the booth with Sophie's drawing pressed against her coat, feeling the strange nearness of her own past. Then Sophie returned. She carried a dented blue metal box decorated with faded daisies on the lid. She held it with both hands as though it were heavy, though it could not have weighed more than a few pounds. Ethan stepped toward her. Sweetheart, this isn't what that's for. Sophie held it tighter. Mom said the truth is for when lies get too loud. Ethan closed his eyes briefly. When he opened them, Caroline saw grief, love, and surrender. Sophie placed the box on the table. The metal made a dull sound against the worn surface. With trembling fingers, she opened it. Inside were folded receipts, old envelopes, church bulletins, copies of letters tied together with a faded ribbon. And lying on top was a photograph clipped from a newspaper, yellowed at the edges. Caroline stopped breathing. She knew that photograph. A thin 12-year-old girl in thick glasses standing outside St. Agnes Children's Home after surgery, smiling as if hope was something she had just been handed and had not yet decided whether she was allowed to trust. Caroline reached toward it, then stopped, as though touching it might collapse all the years between then and now. Ethan spoke quietly. "Sophie, put it away." "No," she said, already crying. "He said you need money. He said you were pretending. You're not pretending." Preston leaned closer, his voice stripped of its polish. "What is all this?" Mrs. Brooks answered from behind the counter. "It's what he never wanted anyone to see." Caroline picked up one of the letters. The paper was old. The ink had faded slightly, but the handwriting struck her like a song remembered in a dark room. "You are not alone. Keep reading. The world will need what you see." At the bottom were two initials. E.M. Her hands began to shake. She picked up another receipt. The donor's name was written clearly. Ethan Miller. The amount was $2,743. The date was from the winter when Caroline had nearly abandoned her education because she could no longer afford new lenses and medical treatment. Caroline looked at Ethan. He turned his eyes away, not ashamed of what he had done, only humbled that he had been discovered. "It was you," she whispered. Ethan's voice was barely louder than the snow tapping against the windows. "It was never supposed to be about me." The room became completely silent. Even Preston said nothing. Caroline pressed the letter against her chest. The billionaire who owned towers, companies, and headlines stood inside a small-town diner with tears in her eyes, staring at a poor single father who had carried pieces of her future inside a blue metal box for years. Caroline said almost nothing after that. She carefully folded the old letter with hands that had signed billion-dollar contracts without trembling, placed it inside her coat, and looked at Ethan as though the entire room had rearranged itself around him. "The gala begins in 30 minutes, Preston said, desperately trying to pull the evening back into its planned shape. "We can discuss this later, privately, after legal verification." Caroline turned toward him. "No." One small word. Quiet. Final. Ethan stood beside the booth with one hand resting on Sophie's shoulder. "Caroline, you don't owe me anything." She looked at him. The softness in her eyes carried years of unanswered prayers. "That," she said, "is where you're wrong. I owe the truth." 27 minutes later, the grand hall of the Whitaker Education Initiative glowed beneath crystal chandeliers, white tablecloths, silver cutlery, and the gentle music of a string quartet. Outside the hotel windows, snow continued falling over Maple Falls. Inside, everything was warm, polished, expensive. Donors in dark suits spoke quietly with local officials. Reporters adjusted microphones. A banner stretched behind the stage. "Every child deserves a future." Preston moved quickly through the ballroom, issuing instructions to staff, changing place cards, removing one chair from the front row and adding another near the back. He had constructed the entire evening around a perfect story. Caroline Whitaker, visionary billionaire, returns to rural America to expand educational opportunity. It was inspiring, useful, safe. Then Caroline entered with Ethan Miller and Sophie beside her. And the room lost its script. People turned. Conversations faded. Preston hurried toward her, his smile stretched almost to breaking. "Caroline, I've arranged a separate table for Mr. Miller. Appearing together creates a complicated impression." Ethan immediately stepped back. "I can wait outside." Sophie grabbed his sleeve. Caroline did not raise her voice. "He's coming with me." "This isn't strategy," she added. "It's honesty." The conversation was over. The quartet finished its piece. Polite applause followed as Caroline stepped onto the stage. For a moment, she stood behind the podium beneath the warm lights, looking at people who had come expecting inspiration without discomfort, charity without confession, generosity without humility. Preston stood near the curtain holding her prepared speech on a tablet. Caroline looked at the first line, then turned the tablet face down. A murmur moved through the ballroom. "When I was 12 years old," she began, "I could barely see the words written on the classroom board." The room quieted. I lived in a children's home where the roof leaked every March and the radiators knocked through the night. I had no family with savings, no famous name, and no reason to believe the world was waiting for me. Ethan lowered his eyes. Sophie leaned against him. Caroline continued, her voice steady but full of feeling. Then someone I had never met began sending money. Small amounts by the standards of this room.
$40. $18.
Once, $2,743. But those gifts paid for lenses, books, transportation, and an operation that changed the way I saw the world. One reporter slowly lowered his pen. A woman in the front row covered her mouth. Preston's face had gone pale. Caroline pulled the old letter from inside her coat and held it up. With every gift came a note. You are not alone. Keep reading. The world will need what you see. For 22 years, I searched for the person who wrote those words. She looked toward the back of the ballroom. Ethan stood there in his worn jacket, trying to disappear beside a velvet curtain. Tonight, Caroline said, I found him. The entire room followed her gaze. Hundreds of eyes turned toward the single father whom some people had quietly mocked in a diner less than an hour earlier. Ethan did not move. He did not smile. He did not claim the moment. He simply placed one hand over Sophie's, as though reminding himself that fame was only another kind of weather. And a good man did not need to step into every storm. Caroline's voice softened. His name is Ethan Miller. He is not a story for our brand. He is not a symbol for our company. He is the reason I am standing here. For the first time that evening, the ballroom was not impressed. It was silent, and that silence lasted longer than applause would have. It moved from table to table, past crystal glasses and folded programs, past men who had donated millions yet never missed an opportunity to carve their names into buildings, past women who suddenly looked at Ethan Miller as though they had nearly walked past a cathedral without noticing it. Ethan remained beside the velvet curtain with Sophie pressed against his side. His eyes were lowered. His shoulders still carried the posture of a man more comfortable giving than receiving praise. Caroline stepped away from the podium. Preston hurried toward her, panic hidden beneath a professional whisper. Don't do this. Thank him. Give him a plaque. Let the room applaud and move on. Caroline looked at him. Move on from what? From the discomfort. Whose discomfort? Preston glanced toward Ethan, then toward the donors. A billionaire does not strengthen her authority by bowing to a diner cook. Caroline's face changed. Not with anger. With disappointment so deep that anger was no longer necessary. No, she said quietly. A person strengthens their character when they understand when bowing is exactly what they should do. She walked past him. The microphones caught the faint sound of her heels against the polished floor as she left the stage and crossed the center aisle toward the back of the ballroom. Every head turned with her. No one coughed. No one whispered. Even the musicians sat motionless, their bows resting across their knees. Ethan saw her approaching and shook his head slightly, almost pleading. Caroline, he said when she reached him. Please, don't turn me into something I'm not. She stopped in front of him, close enough that only the first rows could hear clearly, though the microphone still carried fragments of every word. And what exactly are you not? She asked. Important. Sophie looked up quickly. Caroline's eyes filled with tears again, but her voice remained steady. You gave when no one could ever know. You believed in a child who had nothing to give you in return. You helped me see the world before the world ever looked at me. If that isn't important, then this room has misunderstood the meaning of the word. Ethan swallowed. His hand tightened around Sophie's. Someone helped me too, he said. My wife believed in that scholarship fund before I did. I just kept sending the envelopes after she died because it felt like keeping a promise. The room softened. Not dramatically. Just a quiet breath from hundreds of people realizing that the greatest gifts sometimes came from those already carrying their own grief. Caroline looked at Sophie. Then your mother must have been extraordinary. Sophie nodded. Her tears shone but did not fall. Dad says she still teaches us. She's just quieter now. Caroline placed one hand over her heart. Then, while the cameras remained lowered and every powerful person in the room watched, she turned toward an empty table near Ethan at the back wall. It was an unreserved table. There was no name card.
Noriben.
No visible price. Just a table placed where people were seated when no one knew exactly how to honor them. Caroline touched the back of a chair, and in a voice quieter than the room expected, she asked, "May I sit with you?" Ethan looked at her. For one breath, all the years between them seemed to gather in the space around that chair. The church basement, the old letters, the pancakes in the diner, the blue metal box, the snow, the humiliation, the grace. Then Ethan smiled almost imperceptibly. "You already are." Caroline sat beside him. Not on the stage. Not beneath her own name. Not under the banner of her foundation. But in the back row beside a single father and his daughter. No one applauded immediately. They could not. Some moments require hands. This one required humility. Preston remained near the stage, the tablet still glowing uselessly in his hand. His prepared speech no longer mattered. Across the room, donors lowered their eyes. Some quietly removed donation cards from their jackets. Not because they wanted recognition, but because recognition suddenly seemed like too small a reason to give. Sophie leaned across Ethan and slipped her mismatched mitten into Caroline's hand. Caroline held it like a promise. Only then did the applause begin. Slowly, unevenly, almost shyly. Then it grew. Not for wealth. Not for a brand. Not for a perfect company. But for the quiet dignity of a man who had changed a life from the shadows and had never once asked the world to shine a light on him. Near the end of the evening, Caroline Whittaker did something no one expected. She returned to the stage. Not to take the attention back, but to give it away. Ethan stood with Sophie near the back wall, still uncomfortable with the applause. Still looking as though he would rather repair a loose hinge at the diner than hear his name spoken beneath chandeliers. Caroline placed both hands on the podium and looked across the ballroom with a strength that was quieter and cleaner than before. "Tonight was supposed to be about my foundation," she said. "But I think we have been building the wrong monuments." The room listened. Preston stood silently by the curtain, his tablet hanging uselessly at his side. "We put names on buildings," Caroline continued. "We put faces on companies. We seat donors in the front row. But the man who changed my life never wanted the front row. He wanted a child to have glasses, a book, a bus ticket, a reason to keep going." She turned toward Ethan. "And because of that, from this night forward, this initiative will carry the spirit of what he and his wife began." 3 months later, the old brick schoolhouse on Maple Street reopened as the Miller Lite Center. It was not named to glorify Ethan. It was named to honor the light his family had passed from one pair of hands to another. The center provided tutoring, eye examinations, winter coats, after-school meals, art classes, and quiet rooms where children could read without being rushed or judged. On opening day, Ethan arrived before sunrise to help Mrs. Brooks arrange folding tables and chairs. He still wore the same jacket. He still drove the same old blue pickup. When a reporter asked why he had not moved into the larger house Caroline had offered to help him buy, Ethan smiled. "A bigger house doesn't make a person bigger," he said. "But a bigger table can feed more people." Caroline never tried to rescue him from his life. She respected it. She funded the center, protected his privacy, and continued visiting Miller's Diner every Thursday evening. She always sat in the last booth. She always asked Sophie what she had drawn that week. Over time, the town stopped whispering about the billionaire and the diner cook. People began noticing something better. How Caroline laughed more easily. How Sophie saved her a seat without needing to ask. How Ethan's grief slowly made room for grace. Nothing rushed. Nothing dramatic. Just respect becoming friendship. Friendship becoming trust. And trust slowly becoming the kind of love that does not erase the past but quietly sits beside it. Years later, visitors to the Miller Lite Center often stopped in front of a small framed note near the entrance. It was written in Ethan's careful handwriting. Some people change the world not by rising above it, but by saving one place for someone else. Beneath it, in Sophie's handwriting, were 3 small words. "Sit with us." Because dignity does not need to shout. Grace does not need applause. And kindness given quietly never truly disappears. It travels through years, through strangers, through children, through storms, until one day, it returns as a miracle, and pulls out a chair for you. If this story touched your heart, tell us in the comments about an act of kindness you still remember, or about someone who once saved you a seat when you felt alone. Thank you for watching until the end.